I'm Pam Klauser McCann, and I am doing my research update today. It's based on a project that you see here, looking at policy negotiations between the House and the Senate in Congress. And I actually live in the Bedrosian Suite, almost practically live in the Bedrosian Suite. I spend a lot of time there. And so I told them they did not need to introduce me. I was happy to do so myself. This is my fourth year here at USC. I'm an assistant professor here, and I graduated from the University of Michigan. I have a PhD in political science and in public health. Go Blue! Heartbreaking, right? Heartbreaking football season, but anyway, so I know the Trojans, it wasn't so much a heartbreak, but I haven't gotten there yet. 4 years. I spent 7 years at the University of Michigan. That's what happens when you do a joint PhD. It takes a lot longer. But I lived in Ann Arbor for almost 15 years. So before coming back to grad school and doing a PhD, I was actually a genetic counselor. And I became quite interested in trying to understand how policy actors made the policy choices that they did. And the reason for that is that when I was seeing my patients, I was often influenced by new legislation, whether it was mostly at the state level or the national level. The partial birth abortion ban, for instance, occurred while I was practicing as a genetic counselor. And so these created a number of difficulties for my patients whom I didn't think were actually the targets of the legislation, but I didn't understand that fully. When you get trained in genetics, you actually don't get a lot of political science, although you do get we call it ELSI, it's the ethical, legal, and social implications of genetics. So that's why I went back to school. And I'm really excited to share with you my project. This is actually the start of a pretty large project. The first paper out of this has quite a bit more detail in it than I'll provide you with here. But the second and third papers are really at the beginning stages, and I would love some feedback in terms of thinking about directions in terms of where to go. I'm working on this with a colleague of mine who's at Binghamton. He and I both went to grad school together, and he is a legislative studies scholar. And let's see if I can work this. So the motivation for this project is that policy is a framework. So when you think about legislation in particular, this is a framework for programs, for services, the words that are put on a piece of paper when legislators and interest groups or whoever else helps craft legislation. What that does is it provides the skeleton, it provides the outlines of what goes into the legislation. The text of those laws define who implements the policy, what resources they have. This includes money, discretion, who their partners are, all of those sorts of things. And I will get my directions right eventually. There we go. And when you think about our Congress and most of the states' legislatures, we have a bicameral situation, so that two chambers within the legislature have to pass the same version, the same language of the policy for it to be sent to the executive, to the president in the case of the national legislature. And so this sets up a conflict between two chambers, not just inside the chamber itself between individual legislators, but across the chambers as well. And it's not just whether to pass a new policy, but what policy instruments to employ, what language to put into the bill to set up that skeleton of those policy instruments. So this could include more or less regulation, direct service provision versus subsidies to others, decentralization to the states, among other things. In our separation of powers system, the new laws require negotiated agreement between these chambers. So it's not just about the House and the Senate, but also the president comes into play here. So the purpose of this particular project, first, is to develop a measure of chamber-specific textual contributions to these pieces of legislation. In addition to that, we're going to consider two specific research questions. So the first is, what is the nature of the bargains that chambers strike across each other with respect to the US Congress? And what are the conditions under which the Senate or the House exert more influence on the content of the final laws? What chambers get in an intercamberal negotiation depends on a number of things. And this is actually pretty well studied in terms of distributive politics. So when we call it splitting the pie, or bargaining over cakes, or dividing dollars, that's oftentimes what we think of when we're looking at bargaining in legislatures. And some of the things that we find in the literature include that there's intra, so within chamber constraints, as well as across chamber constraints that matter with respect to how that bargaining process proceeds. So the first is that partisan homogeneity and polarization, both within a chamber as well as across chambers, matters quite a bit for how bargaining proceeds and who gets what, how you divide the dollar, which is what they're thinking of with respect to most of the theories that exist. In addition to that, the majoritarian threshold, or how many people you need within a chamber to be able to pass a policy off the floor, matters quite a bit as well. So in the House, we have a simple majoritarian rule, whereas in the Senate, a lot of times the filibuster can come into play. So that's a super majoritarian constraint. So you need a lot more in terms of as a proportion of the members within your chamber, members of the Senate to get on board with a policy for it to even pass off the floor in the first place. In addition to that, some of the other things that matter with respect to formal models that exist in our literature and political science is that patience, or the time horizon of the individual's bargaining, can play a huge role in how much you will get from a bargaining situation. So if you are really impatient, then you get less. Whereas the more patient player or bargainer typically can wait for later, and so they typically can gain more in the bargaining situation. And so with respect to the House and the Senate, a lot of times what people say is this has to do with the fact that with the House, they have a 2-year electoral horizon, whereas it's 6 years in the Senate, or 2/3 when an election comes up, every member of the House is up for election, but only 1/3 of senators are up for election. So many times we translate this empirically to thinking about the fact that the Senate is more patient than the House, although there are some people that question that quite a bit. In addition to that, there's a theory with respect to who is pivotal within the House, who is pivotal within the Senate, and how those individual pivotal actors matter for what the policy looks like and whether there are differences between the chambers themselves. So with respect to the House, it's typically, since it's a simple majority rule in terms of the voting threshold, as I mentioned, that the median of the House is whose preferences over policy outcomes you need to take into account as you're putting together a policy package, because that's the only way that you can get that policy passed off the floor if you have at least the median member involved in terms of their preferences. But in the Senate, you need to take that filibuster individual into account because you have to have those 60 legislators, 60 senators on board in order to get it to pass off the floor. In addition to that, the president has this veto authority in the end, and if the president vetoes a policy, it goes back to the Congress where they have a veto override threshold, which is much larger than the simple majoritarian situation. So in addition to that, the literature has a number of other things that seem to matter. So the Senate's longer time horizon is compounded in terms of the benefit with the Senate with respect to the House is with the supermajoritarian threshold. So the fact that not only is it harder to pass things in the Senate because of the filibuster, but in addition to that, the longer time, the fact that senators are typically more patient or have a much longer time until their election comes up than the House can advantage them even more over the House in this bicameral negotiation between the chambers. The president, if the president's party, if we think about party as some rough proxy for preferences over policy outcomes, then if the party of the president matches the pivotal player in one of the chambers but not the other, then that particular chamber is thought to be advantaged over the other chamber as well. In addition to this, some of the other things that we see in the literature include the order of moves, so that there's a first mover advantage in distributive, even repeated play bargaining situations that you can actually, if you're the sender of a policy proposal in this context, that you can actually design that policy proposal to better match your preferences, taking into account some other constraints in these distributional models, and that individual who crafts the proposal is advantaged in situations. With respect to the House and the Senate, the House actually designs or crafts the revenue bills in Congress. So that's part of the constitutional prerogatives that the House has. And so a lot of times people think that perhaps the House is more advantaged with respect to those, but perhaps not. So there are some very old literature. This is from Schelling in 1956. where he talks about the different types and attributes of bargaining. It's actually a really fun old paper to read. And one of the things he talks about is there's something called tacit bargaining, where it's not just about dividing a pie or distributing a dollar or trying to figure out who gets how many cakes in terms of a bargaining. But in addition to that, you're sending information. When you come up with a policy proposal, in this case, that what you're doing is you're providing information about how eager you are to involve yourself in a negotiation. When you do that, then what you're doing is you're putting yourself open to the second mover, or in this case, the receiver in our bicameral negotiation. You're setting yourself up to being taken more advantage of by the receiver. So in that case, the second mover, the receiver, might be the one who's more advantaged. In addition to that, Binder and Lee talk about something called integrated bargaining. And so this is thinking about the fact that instead of dividing a pie, that policy can sometimes expand the pie. So you can start to add additional, whether they're dimensions to policy, or bundle together different types of packages. So whether it's food stamps with farm aid bills, or that's one of the traditional examples that people give in terms of bundling, that when you do that, that gives you more opportunities to gather a coalition of individuals willing to pass something. And so if you're the second mover in a situation, you may actually be benefited by moving second instead of first. So, as you can see, the existing theoretical frameworks that we have, or the theoretical models, have these are really the sort of common strings among all of them. And when you look at this, there's a number of different moving pieces. They're moving in different directions. But one of the problems we've really run into with respect to the bargaining literature is that we're traditionally just looking at dividing dollars. So appropriations is the most common place where we're looking at this, is who's getting more and how are they designing appropriations. But one of the things that we're trying to do here is we're really trying to think about what is it that a chamber's doing when they're putting together those words on a document that counts as their bill, that they're willing to pass off their floor and either send to the other chamber or to receive from a particular chamber. And so when I try to figure out how can we think through what are the hypotheses that exist in the literature, that we can take a look at our new measure that we're developing and come up with a plan for looking at them empirically, that set of literature that I just went through provides us with some expectations. So that a chamber's unique contribution to a law is expected to increase in the size of its majority party, and decrease for the House in that second year of the term, and that was due to the patience. Increase when a pivotal actor matches the president, and increase for the House when the median lines up with the Senate's filibuster compared to when they're not aligned. But the difference in a Senate versus House contribution is really uncertain, because that's not something that's been covered in the literature up till now. Additional hypothesized associations based on the theoretical framework that I just went through. A change is expected in a chamber's unique contribution as polarization rises. So we think that it might increase if the unique contribution is really an important factor to the ways in which the House and Senate bargain. But it might decrease if, in fact, what it is it's about finding consensus, not unique contributions to final policies. In addition to that, some of the associations is that the first mover might matter, but as I mentioned, maybe it's the receiver, the second mover, who matters. And so perhaps this will increase with distributional policies. So compared to being a second mover, the receiver, that if you're the sender, you have more unique contribution. But it's hard to say from the existing literature whether there's an increase or decrease for different types of legislation, which if we look across legislation within that comes out of the US Congress, very little of it is just distributional. Our empirical framework. So that was just a setup. That's the stuff we already know in the literature and some of the things that people have looked at in lots of different ways. So what we're really trying to do here is come up with a good measure of chamber contributions to policy across policy types, across policy tools and instruments and all the things that go into a piece of legislation, and over time. Since laws use words to encode policy choices, we're going to use automated textual analyses to provide a measure of policy negotiation, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about it. So this is what it looks like. So first of all, I was trying to figure out what's the best way to show this. There's two policy proposals. So let's think of a bill as a box. So this is a box. This is the House Senate bill box. And in that box, the House decides what policy instruments to put in. More regulation, direct service provision, maybe they delegate something to the states, for instance. So that's what the House puts in their box. And each of these squares is supposed to represent a word. So that's what the box is. And then the Senate comes along, and it doesn't matter right now who moves first versus second. And the Senate box looks a little bit different than the House, but there is some overlap. So perhaps they use some of the same instruments, but they also use very different instruments or different language. So some of the other things that you do when you write a piece of legislation is that you're doing a number of symbolic sentences and words. So those could also be in either one of the bills. So here's an example. One of them could be, so the Affordable Care Act is something we hear a lot about in the literature. If we actually go back to what the Affordable Care Act, the House bill and the Senate bill really looked like, and what is actually in those particular policies, what we can see is that the House bill set up a national level exchange. Obviously that one did not win because we don't have national level exchanges, but they set up a national level exchange so that people could sign up for insurance with this national level entity. Up to, in terms of who was eligible for the exchange, it's up to 400% of the federal poverty level. There was an employer mandate as well, that employers had to provide health insurance. There was a Medicaid expansion up to 150% of the federal poverty level. There was an individual mandate, such so that individuals had to sign up for health insurance, or they would have a tax, which was 2.5% of adjusted income, up to the average basic national premium that was set up by the national level exchange. Now, let's look at what the Senate Finance Bill, which was actually the language that we ended up with. And so with this, what you find is they have state level exchanges. You're eligible between 100 and up to 400% of the federal poverty level. An employer mandate, which is exactly the same. The Medicaid expansion up to 133% of the federal poverty level. An individual mandate, and then a tax, which was slightly different than the tax that the House bill had chosen. Now, if we look at what happens then when you have a final bill, so you have Senate language, you have House language, and then a final law comes in, and it can, and this is actually just an example of what any might look like. So you have the language from the House bill, the language from the Senate bill. This is what the final language involves, and it includes some words from the Senate bill, some words just from the House bill, and then this is what we call the consensus region. And so in this region, these are words that were chosen in both bills, both the House bill and the Senate bill. And then this is language that was brand new. It came in after the House passed their floor version and the Senate passed their floor version. So this language can come from negotiation between the House and Senate after the initial floor passage. So there are a couple of different ways. Either it went to conference committee, and the conference committee negotiated the agreement and added in those things, or they ping-ponged amendments back and forth between the House and Senate on just their floor. And there's also some other regions here where we have, so this is a region where the final bill, let's see here, so here's the final bill is right here. So the House and Senate overlapped in this region, but it was not included in the final language for whatever reason. This is language right here that came directly from the Senate bill and the language that came from the House bill. And this is, I don't know if you want to call it fluff or leverage or whatever this might be. These are the words that the Senate included, the words that the House included that were not then a part of the final negotiated package. So with the House bill and the Senate bill, the final law, the things that ended up in this, in the consensus region, or in terms of the things that were bold throughout all of these, so that there is a tax, and that it differs, so it's changed slightly. So instead of being 2.5% of the adjusted income up to the average basic national premium or the $750, what they did is they changed it slightly so that it was a little bit of in between those two, right? And then the exchanges were available between 133% and 400% of the federal poverty level. There's actually lots of different ways that you can put together the package. So we've already talked about this. So this is ways that you can actually measure things then. The unique House contribution to a bill is actually B, the number of words within B over the total words within the final law. Yes?
Just a question for clarification.
Yes.
When you're talking about word, you talking about all words in a document, or are you talking about keywords? For example, here you're showing, you're focusing on the actual policy elements as opposed to just, there may be a lot of text that's not actually, there may be a lot of words that aren't essential to defining the policy elements.
I see what you mean.
Kind of preamble, for example.
So I'm using an example here and focusing on the keywords, but in fact, using automated textual analysis, we look at all the words within the document. And some of those words, so we take out the preamble, we take out what we call the boilerplate text. So we take out the table of contents, the preamble, we take out the legislative history, which is at the bottom of every law. We take out sort of passed by or signed by the clerk of the House or and of the Senate. And so the boilerplate text that occurs in each of these bills and legislation we take out, but we leave all the other words and compare them.
Yeah, so I mean, just to use a kind of trivial example, I mean, if the Senate bill says we absolutely advocate in favor of a national change, and the House bill says we absolutely abhor the idea of a national, many of the words are aligned, but they're completely different
meaning and context. Absolutely. So one of the ways, that's actually one of the validation techniques that we need to, or validation exercises that we're working on at the moment, is looking at sentiment alongside with changes. And what we're finding right now, we've only been able to process a few of the bills here, is that we don't see a huge difference. So when the Senate bill is really different from the House bill, it's a lot different. And I'll go through what the technique looks like and then come back, because this is actually a really important question with respect to validating what's going on. So the different measures that I'm going to show you what things look like are these four here, although, as I mentioned, there's actually lots of different things we could gather from this. So we have the unique proportion of the final law that is due to House language, the unique from the Senate language, and then the negotiation proportion, which that's what this proportion is here. It was added afterwards, so it's part of the negotiated final agreement. And then the consensus region, which is this region right here. There's lots of different configurations of bills that you can see in final laws. And so, for instance, this is actually what the Affordable Care Act negotiation looked like. The House passed their version, A. The Senate came in and passed their version, and the final law is pretty much almost exactly the text of the Senate law, and there is some consensus region. But there's lots of different things. So here, this has all of the theoretically possible regions that we could see. But here, what we see is the House passed a bill, the Senate passed a bill. There was no overlap between the two of them. And the final law includes some language from the House, some from the Senate, and then lots of negotiation between the two. Over here, what we see is the same sort of thing, but in fact, they didn't add any extra stuff in during the negotiation process. And this is the House bill, just as I mentioned. So operationalizing this, so relative chamber contributions to a final law, what we did to do this is we gathered the text of bills and laws, we matched them using congress.gov, as well as using Legislative Insight, which is provided by ProQuest. And what those do is they provide you with lots of information about the actions taken, what linked bills there are, as well as the legislative history that's involved in passing a final law. So one of the issues that we're dealing with right now is that in this first set of things, we're just looking at successful negotiations. This is ones where a final law was passed, and so something went well, something went right in that process. Extensions to the project include collecting bills where each or one of the houses proposed a bill and it either went nowhere or they couldn't come to a final agreement, but that isn't a part of the first paper here. What we do is, in addition to that, we went through the House calendar and tried to figure out, were there other Senate bills that matched with what the House passed as their bill? And we tried to figure out, based on those, which bills are linked with each other. So this process was extremely time consuming, because it turns out, maybe if you think about it a little more carefully, it makes a lot of sense. It's really hard to know what is the matched bill in the Senate to the House. So if the House passes one environmental regulation, It'd be nice if the Senate called their bill the exact same thing. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but it's really hard. In addition to that, when Congress.gov, which used to be Thomas, when they provide the initial piece of legislation, so the Affordable Care Act, it's actually a House designation in terms of its HR, I think it's 3590. But what happened is the Senate, so the House had passed something, it was actually for returning veterans and their home owners insurance or providing mortgages or something along those lines. The House had already passed that. It was a revenue generating bill. So the Senate picked this bill up, stripped it of all of the language, and plopped in their Finance Committee bill and renamed it. So if we compared the House passed version, which was about veterans and home mortgages, to the legislation, or to the Senate passed bill, which is about which ended up being the Affordable Care Act, there's very little overlap. So what you had to do is really look through the legislative history of what was going on in the House to find the actual House Tri-Committee bill that was their piece of legislation. And so that's what we did. It took a really long time, actually a little over a year, to do that for all of the pieces of legislation here. But we also started out just looking at important bills. And so these are bills thought to be deemed to be significant in a couple of different ways. So there's lots of different measures. So we can use David Mayhew's a political scientist who has looked at contemporaneous and then looking in the past reviews of what are important pieces of legislation that Congresses pass. So we use that as one measure of importance. But we also use a significant measure from Adler, Howell, Cameron, and Wilkerson, another set of political scientists who what they did is they actually looked at the number of pages that CQ Almanac devotes, or that's probably a rough proxy. If they devoted more than 6 pages of coverage over time to a particular piece of legislation, they deemed that to be significant. So that's another way of measuring significance. And another one, which comes from 2 other political scientists, Volden and Weissman, Craig Volden and Alan Weissman. What they do is they actually look at CQ key votes and use those as measures of whether a piece of legislation is significant. So what we do is we look at, we tried to gather as many of those as we possibly could. And we also gathered a random collection within, or random sample within every Congress, the same number as the significant pieces of legislation for each of the Congresses in our study. So we have substantive bills that aren't considered to be significant, and we have substantive and significant bills. So what this means is a lot of the legislation that Congress passes are commemorative. So things like naming post offices or changing different names of bridges. There's lots of different things, and we call those commemorative pieces of legislation. And so those are not included in this data set. So what we do is we have the first pass version by the House, the first pass version by the Senate, and then we have the final enactment. So what this means, it's also hard. How do you pick what counts as the Senate bill and the House bill? And so what we decided is if it actually passed the floor of that particular chamber, that was a credible bill from that particular chamber. And so finding the first passed House version and first passed Senate version included lots of looking through the congressional record. ProQuest Legislative Insight, which USC Library has a subscription to, thank them very much, it's wonderful, allowed us to be able to map those together. Then what we did is we used a publicly available, it's free, you don't even have to download it, you can run it from the website, plagiarism text analysis tool. It's called WCopyFind. And what we did is this allowed us to look at the proportion of shared language between the different texts that we have. So we have these 3 measures, a House bill, a Senate bill, and a final law. And we look to see how many of those words are overlapping. WCopyFind also does this really nice thing where it HTML tags any of the shared language. You can actually set the parameters of the way you do the search, like how strict is the search, how easy is the search? Do you look for one change in a law, or does it have to change lots of different pieces of law or of language to go through this? And so what we do is we run this, changing the parameters slightly and in large ways, and so those data validation checks my collaborators working on, so hopefully those will come through probably very soon, we hope so. But what you end up, you have a Senate to final version, a House to final, and a House to Senate, and the Senate to House. And that actually matters because then what we can do is we can scrape out all that shared language because we look for the HTML tags. scrape them out automatically. And then what we can do is we use these, what's left then from the scraped bill is all of the language in the House bill that was unique to the House bill. All of the language in the Senate bill that was unique to the Senate bill, because we were comparing those two to each other. And then we rerun wcopyfind with those fixed Senate and fixed House bills to the final. So what we can do is, if you remember back to the boxes, we gather information on the actual measures of A, B, C, D, E, and F, all of the different regions within the bills that we're looking at, so that we can calculate the proportion of unique House and unique Senate contribution, the consensus, and the negotiated region. When we do that, what we find is that, so here's House unique, Senate unique, the consensus region, and the negotiation region. And how much time do I have, Aubrey, till?
We go until 1:30.
Okay, good, so I have time. So what we have here is, this is the breakdown. These are all final laws. These are the substantive, and then those final laws break down into the substantive laws and the substantive and significant laws. So that's what these second and third columns are, or third and fourth columns. And then we have whether it's initiated by the House or initiated by the Senate, and the different versions. So we have in total 534 laws, of which 173 of those, and we're looking from the 1973 through 2016, and so the 93rd through the 114th Congress. And what we have is we have 173 of those are significant laws, and this is using Volden and Weissman's categorization. So the CQ counted it as a key vote on the piece of legislation or any of the bills leading up to it that led to this. And what we see is that, and these are percentages here. And so all final laws, so the House unique language makes up, on average, about 7.5% of the final language of laws. The Senate is almost, but not quite twice that, so 11%. The consensus region is on average more than half of the language in final laws. It came from both bills, both the House bill and the Senate bill. And then the negotiated region is almost a third of the final language in bills. Now this depends on if you're looking at substantive laws that aren't counted to be significant. So this includes something such as a recent piece of legislation that was passed that required all public restrooms to have baby changing facilities within them. And so that was a substantive law, but it wasn't counted to be a significant change for whatever reason, in terms of congressional quarterlies designations. In terms of the significant laws, we see that the House contribution doesn't change much, but the Senate contribution increases slightly, is a little higher in significant laws than in non-significant, and the consensus region goes down, and the negotiated region goes up. Now this fits pretty well with what we think is happening. So the Senate is advantaged to the House overall, and so we do see that slightly here in terms of the averages. In addition to that, there has to be it looks like there needs to be a great deal of consensus before successful negotiations, or as a part of successful negotiations now that we're looking backward in time, and that the negotiation process between the House and Senate might be really important to what's going on. In terms of looking at differences by sender, so when the House initiates their bill, instead of us seeing a first mover advantage on average, so these are just tabs, we see that their unique proportion goes down, but the Senate's unique proportion goes up. And so the House, if it is the Senate, if it's a first mover, seems to be advantaged, but the Senate seems to do better in terms of unique language that it's providing than the House does, which I think is an interesting thing. I haven't seen that in terms of empirical analyses and data before. This is the overall summary. Significant laws, consensus increases or decreases, and Senate unique increases. While the Senate uniquely contributes almost twice as much as the House does in House-initiated bills, one of the things that you might not have seen in that lots of messy table is that the House's unique contribution to a final law is highest when they're the second mover, so when the Senate moves first, although they're still not, their contribution is less still than the Senate. So this is where I go with in terms of looking across Congresses, and then I'll show you the next one is a picture of just as a scatter plot of what the individual laws look like. And so it doesn't do that, but that would be a fun extension to do too. I think that would be good. So this is the 93rd to the 114th Congress. So this is the one that just finished. So this was the 100 in terms of 2014 to 2016 is right here. And what you can see is, so in blue we have House unique contribution. And so these should add up to 1. We have the Senate unique contribution, the consensus region, and the negotiation region from those bill overlaps. So what we see here is that over time, the House unique contribution varies a little bit, but definitely goes way down in these last 2 Congresses that we've seen. In addition to that, the Senate unique contribution, we can see it's higher than the House most of the time, although not always. Sometimes it's the exact same. In addition to that, we can see that it went down as well. It's the lowest in the last 2 Congresses, which fits with that it seems like it was really difficult for Congress to pass any pieces of legislation. In addition to that, one of the interesting things that I wasn't expecting to see is that the consensus region dominates after the 101st and beyond Congress. The consensus region is the most common thing that you see in the final piece of legislation in terms of the proportion of the words. But before that, it was more about the negotiation or almost an equal contribution of that consensus and negotiation. So after the 101st Congress, the consensus region, the most 2 recent Congresses have the lowest unique contribution, as I mentioned. So here's the individual, so each of these dots represents 1 law. And if you look at, and what I have here is, it was really difficult to figure out what's a concise way of doing this. This is the difference in unique chamber contribution. And so the difference is take the Senate unique contribution and subtract off the House unique contribution. And so negative values is when the House contributes more, 0 is when they have an equal contribution, and positive values are when the Senate contributes more. Or contributes more. And so what we see is that here's the breakdown in terms of the N. So 140 laws, the House contributes more, and 218 the Senate does. So we were looking at averages before, and so these are the specific numbers. And then an equal contribution is actually 176 of those laws, 33 of which were significant, and we do see a difference in terms of House versus Senate unique contribution with significant laws. And so what you can see is, so the 0 line here, that's at 0, versus the ones above the 0 line is when the Senate contributes more, and below the 0 line would be when the House contributes more. And so there's actually quite a bit of variation across Congress and within laws as well. So when we're looking at this, it's fine to look at crosstabs and pictures and the descriptive statistics, but given the fact that we have a very well-developed theoretical foundation for bargaining models in Congress, I thought it would be really interesting for us to take a look at those variables that existing literature thinks should be important in these associations to see how well do those perform in models in this sample using this measure to see, do we actually see things moving in the way that we were expecting them to. And so we have the proportion of a chamber in the majority party, election year, whether there's a pivot match. And I used a categorical variable for this, where it's categorized as a 1 when the House matches the Senate, matches the president. All of them are the same, and there's quite a few of those. When the House median, 2 is when a House median is equal to the president, but not the Senate filibuster. And so in this, we would expect the House median to be advantaged. In 3, we expect the Senate to be advantaged to the president because the House median does not match the president. And this is one when the House and the Senate filibuster match each other, but not the president. And so these line up with those expectations that I listed earlier. In addition to that, there I have a House polarization and a Senate polarization measure, and that's using common space scores, or actually denominate scores, to look to see the difference between the median of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party within each Congress over time. Whether or not the House or the Senate sent the bill, were the initial floor to pass the bill. And so it's a 0 if it's the House, and it's a 1 if the Senate was the one to initiate this. And this is actually something that I didn't spend much time on, but this was also a difficult variable to capture because sometimes you can't just use the designated bill. You have to look to see who actually passed the matched bill within their Congress, and when did they pass it? Not when did they draft it, but when did they actually pass it off the floor in their particular chamber. So one of the extensions would be to look at what does the actual negotiation process within a chamber look like when it was proposed, how long it took to pass it on the floor, and how does that matter, but that's not what we have here. In addition to that, I use a dichotomous variable to capture appropriations policy. This was a really hard one to do, and so what I did is I just, if it was an appropriations policy in terms of as it was designated, then I coded that as a 1, and it was coded as a 0 otherwise. I was trying to get the best strict measure of a distributive policy as opposed to one that was maybe more integrated or had lots of different things in it, moving pieces, so it's non-distributive as well as distributive. But if you have ideas about better ways to capture this, I would love to hear them. So the empirical model, there's a couple of different ways you can run that. Actually, there's lots of different ways. And so the first one that I'll show you is looking at this difference in the contribution and including all of the different variables that I mentioned, and so interactions between the sender and the appropriations. So that's capturing whether it's distributive or not, and does that matter for being first or second in terms of the negotiation sequence. And another thing that we could do in terms of using difference in contribution, we could substitute in the unique proportion of the bill that was from the House and run a model that way. And so I'll show some of those results, as well as the unique contribution from the Senate. With the difference in contribution, it runs from negative 0.91 up to positive 0.95. And so I ran it as just an ordinary least squares regression. You could also do Tobit or lots of different things like that. So far, in terms of robustness checks, I haven't seen it mattering in terms of how I put that together. So I just will present the regression here. So let's see, so here's my variables. For the large, so this was with 34 laws. I include controls for policy type. So a dummy for using the Policy Agendas project. They have major topic codings. So I include a variable for each, or basically just index that variable. I include a control for significance, unified government, and federal revenue growth to try to capture whether or not they're in more constrained environments. But I can't include all of those in the looking at, this should be the significant laws. Interesting. So because of the fact that when I'm looking at, if I include those, I have way too many variables. I only have 173 significant laws, and so what I do is I run this with no controls, all laws, and this should be the significant laws right here, just to show you the differences between them. And so what we find is when I leave out the controls, this actually matters for a number of things in terms of if we look at the proportion of a majority. But none of those are significant, so the proportion of the majority doesn't seem to matter for the difference in the House or the Senate versus House contribution. The things that do in terms of all laws, and when you just look at the significant laws themselves, the differences in the pivot matches does seem to be an important, and it's matching sort of what we're expecting. So in terms of when the House, and let's see, so this is when the Senate filibuster equals the president. We would expect this to be more positive and this to be negative. And so some things match, but others do not. But most of the other variables here are not significant. And these are marginal effects. What I'm reporting here, which in a regression is similar, or they're the same thing. But since this is an interaction, I put the marginal effects. And also I'm showing when I use the unique proportion in the second set of regressions, I use a fractional probit model. And so with that, we would need to include, the marginal effects are easier to take a look at. And so with respect to this, we also see that many of the things we expect to matter in models of bargaining between the chambers don't hold up with this particular measure. And so that's interesting. It may be issues with the measure itself, or it may be that we don't have good models of non-distributive or combinations of distributive and non-distributive legislative packages. What we do see, though, is that it looks like perhaps the Senate, in non-significant legislation, is allowing the House to move first, and then having more of the unique proportion of the language in pieces that they're willing to pass off their floor. So is it that the Senate is using the House as their secretary or as their research assistant. That might be one of the implications of what I'm seeing. In addition to that, the House may be simply reacting to difficulties in the Senate supermajoritarian context. And so the House is actually, in terms of the things that they're able to provide, their unique content is determined a lot by what's going on in the Senate. And so perhaps they're just collecting together or putting together the consensus region to reflect that, or the negotiated regions to reflect that. And those require further testing to really be able to say much about them, but these are some of the initial things that I thought were really interesting in terms of implications, and I would love to hear more feedback. So.
Question I have, and this really goes in a different direction from what you've been emphasizing, not to be in terms of what you're focused on, but what I've been wondering is this is all very interesting for the point of view of modeling and theoretical political science, but what if you're an activist? Is there any way, for example, you could use these data and say, all right, I'm going to spend my scarce lobbying money talking to my senator? Or would it be better to identify 5 potentially influential members of Congress, etc.? Is there any way, either with this fragmented example I've used or anything else, you might have thought of while you're doing this research or really pushing for an activism?
So I think that extensions to this, so it requires a lot more validation, as well as, so some of the validation measures, which I don't talk about here, we go into really in-depth case studies where we look at what did the actual language look like in a few exemplar cases, and to see, does this actually match with what we see? And so I think a lot more of that needs to be done before we move to the place where we would make policy recommendations to activists. But it could potentially, depending on if those happen and if we feel really comfortable with looking at when negotiations don't occur, right? When they aren't successful. Because this is, in terms of for activists, this is a selection bias. So what this does is it just shows you when it did work, what happened. But how do we know that those same things weren't at work also in the less successful sorts of negotiation? And so to really get at that, you need both sets of things. And so what I've been doing is working with another colleague at the Brookings Institute, and we're trying to figure out what's a good way to collect a good sample of bills that failed, that didn't get negotiated. And from that, perhaps, given, so there's lots of ifs, right? Validate, feel really comfortable with it, make sure that there's consensus in sort of the expert communities that that it makes sense, perhaps this is okay, that sort of thing, before I would feel comfortable giving recommendations to that type of an individual. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Kathleen.
Yeah, I think I was struck by when you had the slide with the bar graphs with the House contribution, Senate contribution, and consensus, with the rise in consensus contribution over time, which seemed like, to me, it indicates there's more coordination across chamber, probably between party leaders, and that it also is in some ways aligned with changes in the party structure of Congress, which consolidates power in the party leadership. Yeah. And it seems like there could be something really interesting to do with that, because if there's really large amounts of the text, almost 75% in some of the recent Congresses that is identical, that indicates to some extent that there's some kind of partisan coordination. And I was wondering if you had thought at all about exploring that side of it rather than just, because that to me is a pretty dominant story that
Yes, I know, which I found, I didn't expect that.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew that the consensus region mattered, but that initial set of boxes, that's actually how I thought of things. That the consensus region was, it was there, but not as significant. And so that's kind of interesting. And some of the other things that I don't show here are what I call the fluff, the House fluff and the Senate fluff. How much of that matters for leveraging these two? But yes, so I have thought about it. The problem with this project is that it's massive in some ways, and so it's figuring out how to slice off pieces that are a paper to be under review. So this is just the descriptive, trying to make sure people are okay with the measure and that it's that's working, and showing that, guess what, we've got lots of models of how this bargaining goes, but they're probably lacking a number of the things that we should put in our theoretical understanding. So, but that's a really good question. I'd love to.
In line with the second part of the project that's looking at failed bills too, that could be really interesting. And it could be that if basically the only bills that are making it through are the ones that are pre-coordinated,
Yes.
that have tons of consensus that the party leaders basically worked out.
Yes, I would love to see that. So it's cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do have a question, but a follow-up on that. And one thing you could put the conclusion perspective would just be in contrast to most empirical work showing we're highly polarized. Since the Civil War, the bills that actually do get passed appear to be consensus. And the last 3 Congresses are different leaders, different party leaders, different parties. So that's not good.
Yeah, no, it's really, that's a good thing.
But so I just had a couple questions about the why did you have the percentage proportion within the party as variables at all within the theory? In the theory, didn't you just want to pivot the variables?
So if I leave out the proportion majority, it ends up looking exactly the same. And so just for this thing, I just left them all in. But yeah, the pivot looks the same. It's kind of interesting.
How did you measure equal?
Equal.
If the House is equal to the Senate, then it's equal to the President.
I just used party. So one of the ways that I was thinking of testing robustness was to actually use common space scores and do some kind of a region of approximation. But I have not done that. Yeah.
Just in terms of thinking about trying to explain the variation you have in the content, the unique content that's coming, say, from the House. It tends to be lower than the unique content coming from the Senate, but you have variation, and sometimes it's higher and sometimes it's lower. And you pointed to this first versus second mover explanation, but I'm wondering about other possibilities too. And kind of in that vein, I'm wondering if you think there's an important role played by committees.
Yes, I do.
It's like a really robust finding that we have that's been just documented over and over and over again by so many different papers using so many different data sets that committees don't reflect the floor median.
Yeah, no, it's a good point.
And so I'm interested in if you see them having a role if a lot of bills are developed in committees and committees don't look like the chamber as a whole. They have these preference outliers.
I think it's a really good point, and I should include that. So one of the ways that I initially tried to do it was to use the policy agendas coding for committees, and they're not useful for this. They don't help me identify. There's a lot of missing data and actually a lot of errors just in terms of when I was checking through stuff. And so I need to actually go in and include which committee originated the floor passed and the Senate passed version. And so yeah, I need to have a research assistant come in and do that. So if anyone would like to volunteer for that, awesome. But I think it's a really good idea.